Um, Welcome to the Pearl Street Reconstruction and Safety Improvements Community Meeting number 2. We're going to start with some Zoom instructions. Adam, would you go to the next slide? Thank you all. So first, we'd like to share that this meeting is being held in English and Spanish. I'm going to hand it over to Erica, who's going to give us instructions, introduce themselves, and give us instructions on interpretation this evening. Give us one moment. We're just having some audio issues. Erica, would you like to share our interpretation instructions this evening? There we go. Erica, are you able to unmute? Give us one moment, please. We're going to reach out to our other interpreter. Claudia, would you like to share the instructions? Thanks, folks, for bearing with us. Claudia, would you like to share the instructions?
Sí, con mucho placer. Muy buenas noches. Estamos mucho gusto por estar con nosotros esta noche. Estamos por comenzar nuestra sesión de mejoras en la calle Pearl. Tenemos acceso a la interpretación en español en esta noche. Para poder tener acceso a eso, usted va a ver, como siempre, el globito en la parte de abajo de la pantalla. Yendo allá, usted va a ir a escoger español. Si está en una tableta o en un celular, usted va a los 3 puntitos en la parte de abajo, escoja lenguajes, después español y asegure de hacerle clic para que funcione. Muchas gracias y espero que tenga una sesión muy productiva. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Claudio. Erica, are you able to use your mic now?
Yes, please enable interpretation.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So for everyone, again, make sure to, you can select your language channel in the toolbar below in interpretation and select the language that, that you use. So with that, I'm also going to jump into some other instructions. All of you are joining today muted. Please rename yourself to include your first name and last name if you haven't already done so. After the presentation, we will open the meeting to discussion, and we will first answer questions that came in through the chat and then move to spoken comments. You can send in your written questions through the chat to me, the host, and we'll make sure to read them out loud so they can be heard in both languages. And during the spoken comment, to speak out loud during the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking on the button on the reactions button in your toolbar, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button. We will call on you when it is your turn and unmute your microphone. And if you're joining by phone today, you can press *9 to raise your hand. We're also going to be making sure to help queue people who are in line so that you know if you're up next. If you have any technical difficulties during the Zoom meeting, please reach out to me, Kate White, either via the chat box, by email at kwhite@somervillema.gov, or by phone at 617-366-7293. With that, I'm going to hand it over to the Director of Mobility, Brad Rawson, to welcome us this evening.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening and welcome. My name is Brad Rawson. I serve the City of Somerville as Director of Mobility. I'm also a Somerville resident. On behalf of Mayor Katiana Ballantyne, we hope that you and your families are safe and healthy during this terrible COVID-19 pandemic. Our community stands together to save lives and to support one another. Thank you for participating in our community planning process for Pearl Street in East Somerville. The city has been working to modernize utility infrastructure in East Somerville for several years. Water and gas utility infrastructure have been completed underneath Pearl Street. Now, the city is ready to rebuild sidewalks and repave the street. We are grateful for all of our residents, our workers, our guests, and other stakeholders who have experienced disruption during these utility projects. Now we reach the part that most people get excited about, creating safe, accessible sidewalks, crosswalks, and intersections. As Kate mentioned, tonight's meeting is available for live interpretation in Spanish. I'd like to thank Erica and Claudio for their important interpretation work, and I remind all presenters to speak slowly and clearly. I'd like to acknowledge the participation of several members of the Somerville City Council, but most prominently, Councilor Matt McLaughlin. Councilor Matt McLaughlin is here tonight with us. He is your representative serving as Ward 1 Councilor for the East Somerville neighborhood. Matt also serves as president of the Somerville City Council. Matt is a champion for investment in East Somerville, and he's a great partner for our staff. Councilor, would you like to offer a welcome to our audience?
Thanks, Brad, and thank you everyone for coming. It's Matt McLaughlin, Ward 1 City Councilor, resident of Mount Vernon Street and frequent user of Pearl Street. Happy to see that this project's finally getting underway. I know it's been a painful experience for a lot of people in the neighborhood, myself included, to have to ride and bike and walk on these roads. And I'm happy that we're finally getting there. I would love to hear from residents, people in the audience, especially people who use Pearl Street every day like I do, and just hear what you like, what you don't like. I'm hoping that this gets done soon, but we want to make sure everyone has their input in as much as possible as well and make any changes that might be necessary. So that's all I have. I would like, if I have access to the chat, I'm going to put my email and phone number there if people want to get a hold of me. And if you are interested in getting on my mailing list, you can email me as well if you don't get regular updates. That's all I have. Thank you, everyone, for finally making this happen.
Thank you very much, Matt. We appreciate all your work and partnership. So Kate, why don't I turn it back over to you to facilitate and describe to folks what they can expect for the next hour and a half or so. Thanks again.
Thank you, Brad. So with that, I'd love to introduce our project team. Again, my name is Kate White. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator with the Mobility Division. I'm joined today, as you heard, from Brad, our Director of Mobility, and Adam Polinsky, who's a Senior Planner in the Mobility Division. Also on our project team from the Department of Infrastructure and Asset Management is Brian Postlewaite, our Director of Engineering. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adam, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the project.
Thank you, Kate. All right, so to start tonight's meeting and the meat of our discussion here, I want to briefly run through our agenda. We have a few distinct segments of tonight's meeting. We will be starting with a brief refresher and project overview. We will then be going into a review of the feedback collected to date. We'll then be discussing the street design proposal that we've been working on, and finally ending on a discussion and making sure that we have substantial time to hear from you all on the design proposal. So starting with our project overview. So for anyone who wasn't able to attend the first community meeting or needs a refresher on the scope, construction will be taking place on the eastern half of Pearl Street, starting at McGrath Highway and ending over at Mount Vernon Street. It will include, this construction will include the reconstruction and repouring of all the sidewalks along this segment of Pearl Street, as well as all of the curb ramps. And it will also include the repaving of the street. In addition to those more maintenance type activities, we will also be including a number of traffic safety improvements, which we will get into more detail later in the presentation. Okay, so we have an updated project timeline here for everyone, and that starts with our community meeting that we're currently in. Just so everyone's clear, we are doing things a little bit differently this time around. For our first round of engagement, we had the community meeting towards the end of our community engagement that last April. And this community meeting is actually the first step of the process this time around. So after we release all of these materials from this meeting and give everyone a chance to see where we're currently at, we will then go to all the various stakeholders on the project and spend the next month or so collecting feedback from as many different stakeholder groups and as many individuals as we can to get feedback on our design proposal. Once that's complete, we will finalize a design direction, and we'll then work with our consultant on this project to develop and finalize the engineering plans and have that all ready for the start of construction season, if all goes well. So I don't want to go into too much detail here because we have gone into existing conditions data quite extensively in our last round of outreach and at the first community meeting on Pearl Street. However, I did want to highlight that all of that there is a lot of data that we have collected to date to better understand the context of Pearl Street and East Somerville and what we can and should try to accomplish through this project. Something that I specifically wanted to mention tonight is that one of the specific pieces of specific pieces of data that we feel is particularly important is the variety of abutting land uses. So while this side of Pearl Street is primarily residential, there are also a few businesses, a park, and a place of worship. However, most notable is the East Somerville Community School, where almost 700 students are currently enrolled. Perhaps unsurprisingly, improving the safety of children getting to and from the school was mentioned frequently in the feedback we've received to date. I also wanted to mention that our efforts to collect and analyze data have continued since our last round of engagement. In particular, we've tried to get a better understanding of parking utilization, how many people park on the various streets on this side, in this portion of East Somerville, as well as traffic speeds and traffic volumes along the different sections of Pearl Street. The image on the left here shows how many cars are parked on a given block, either on or near Pearl Street, compared to the total number of available spaces. So that little legend you see in the bottom left corner is a percentage of, essentially a percentage of spaces filled. This data was collected overnight. They're actually specifically very early in the morning, around 5 a.m. Last April, just before our community meeting. However, we've done a little bit more digging into what these data that we collected actually mean and how it fits into the context of the neighborhood and the design process we're going through. For a little bit of additional clarity here in what you're looking at, the red, orange, and darker green colors, the lines on the map show where parking is particularly highly utilized in that overnight time period where we collected data, and the lighter blue colors indicate that there is a number of open spaces on those blocks. And so what you can see here is that there is no uniform trend across the study area. There are some very high concentrations of parking as you get closer to McGrath, as well as some very high concentrations over towards Mount Vernon Street, with a little bit of a surplus of parking availability in the Glen to Franklin Street area. However, in general, you can see that on-street parking within the study area is pretty well used. I did also mention traffic volumes. So for anyone that's interested in a summary of the traffic speed and volume data, I did include that information in the appendix of slides that we have for tonight's meeting, which will be available after the presentation. We'll make sure we upload those to the project page, but I won't go into detail on those right now. So with that, I will turn things back over to Kate to walk us through a summary of the feedback we've received today.
Thank you, Adam. So last summer, following our first meeting on Pearl Street, we conducted a survey. Adam, would you like to go to the next slide, please? And so this survey was available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, and Nepali. And we were able to gather 368 total responses. Taking a look at from some of the folks who we heard from, 9.8% of the respondents shared that they lived on Pearl Street, 45.1% shared that they lived in East Somerville, but not on Pearl Street, 40% shared that they lived in Somerville, but not in East Somerville, and close to 5% shared that they don't live in Somerville. And again, these are just some of the data points that we like to learn about some of the people that we hear from. Diving into some of the travel patterns, we wanted to compare some of the characteristics of the respondents to some of the data points we have available about the project area. So commute data is one type of trip that we have available data, but we know there's a variety of trips that we take through a variety of modes. And sometimes we take those all day or like every day. We might take 3 or 4 modes. So we know this is just one type of data point, but it's helpful as we learn more and more about the street. So of the survey respondents, for typical pre-pandemic commutes, 7% of respondents share that they walked, 27% of respondents biked, 36% of respondents drove or carpooled, 7% of respondents took the bus, and 12% of respondents took the train. Looking at some of our available census data, we looked at typical pre-pandemic commutes of residents who live within 1/4 mile of Eastern Pearl Street. So really within a few minutes walking distance. Of this data, people commuted by walking, or 8% of people commuted by walking, 5% of people biked, 51% of people drove or carpooled, and 11% of people took the bus. 22% of people took the train. To add to this, we also were able to collect some data of people entering Pearl Street through the cross street intersection. And we did this during the morning rush hour in August of 2021 last year. Within our counts, we found that 9% of people walked, 2% of people biked, 62% of people drove, and 27% of people took the bus. And obviously, we don't have any specific data on trains because in that intersection, there's no specific train that goes by. Because we're looking at a specific intersection, it really just counts during that time. But we do recognize that the data collected was conducted while school was not currently in session. So again, just a few points to help us understand some of the characteristics and travel patterns in the area. Next slide, please. So diving into the survey responses, we asked respondents to select their top 3 transportation-related concerns. Of those items, 56% of people said that the street asphalt is in poor condition. 38% of people said that it feels unsafe as a cyclist. 33% of people selected that drivers speeding was a large issue. And 25% of people said the sidewalks are in poor condition. And 22% of people share that the street is too narrow. Looking at potential improvements, in the survey, we provided a list of improvements for Pearl Street and asked respondents to share if they were very important to them, somewhat important, or not important. Combining what we heard of being selected as very important and somewhat important, the following items were selected the most. Improving safety, 90% of people selected improving safety at existing crosswalks. 87% of people selected decreasing speeding. 86% of people selected creating a greener street. 80% of people selected improving safety for people biking, and 78% of people selected improving amenities at bus stops. Now, diving into some of the comments, we really wanted to provide a summary of some of the things that we heard directly from you. Many people shared a high concern for safety of children traveling to the East Somerville Community School, whether by walking, biking, taking the bus, or being dropped off in car. Many also mentioned that they take their children to the daycare centers on Cross and on Pearl. There was a desire for continuous separated bike lanes along the street to improve safety and connectivity to Pearl Street and to access other destinations at East Somerville and Assembly. Many shared about the poor sidewalk and street pavement conditions. As you see, that was also selected as a high concern. Some respondents brought up the parking issues around school pickup and drop off, with some people double parking or circling for parking, which impacts congestion. Many shared the major pedestrian safety issues, especially at intersections, with parked cars blocking the ability to see people in crosswalks. And some residents shared that there's on-street parking demand stress. So that's just some highlights of some of the comments we heard. We also wanted to share with you all some of the feedback we hear in some of our other processes. Adam, would you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. We also look at service requests that we receive through our 311 service. So some people might be aware, you can call, text, use the app to put in service requests through our 311 services. Looking through these comments, we heard that residential streets are being used to cut through the neighborhood to avoid some of our more major roads surrounding by, like Broadway or McGrath. And we heard this more in particular around Myrtle Street. Some residents have requested stop signs at more intersections to ensure that people driving do stop at the intersections to let people walking cross. This came up a couple times with Franklin Street. Residents requested traffic calming elements like speed humps to reduce speeding, both on Pearl Street and surrounding streets like Florence. Residents have reported potholes and pavement qualities, and some have shared about bus delays caused by congestion, especially at Pearl and McGrath. We also hear directly from you, either through emails, through our in-person activities, and phone calls. And we heard many times about speeding, pedestrian safety, and the need to repave the street. And some of these similar comments came up in the available public input map that's also on the project website. So we just want to say thank you so much for those who completed the survey, sent in your feedback. We value this input greatly. With that, I'm going to hand it over back to Adam to tell us a bit about the proposed designs.
Thank you, Kate. And so one more thing I would like to mention as we start to transition to the design proposal is that we try to be cognizant of the fact that while we've heard from many people throughout this process, which is great, we know that we still haven't heard from everyone. And we do want to be explicit about the fact that we are also trying to take into consideration the thoughts and opinions of those that might not be in the room. It's definitely a difficult task and something that we're always trying to improve on, but we know that some people don't have the typical access or time to these community meetings and to staff that others do. And we want to make sure we're doing our best to build a design that incorporates everyone's needs and serves our community as best it can. So with all of that in mind, it can feel like a bit of a daunting task to make sense of all the feedback that we've received, given that we have very narrow streets and not a whole lot of room, but we want our streets to accomplish a lot and serve as many people as possible, as well as possible. But that said, we do believe that there are a few themes emerged, which some of you may have started to gather based on the feedback that we've heard to date. So the first and clearest priority that we've been able to discern is that the condition of the sidewalk and the street are the most important thing to fix through this project, and for that to get done as soon as possible. The second is reducing speed by drivers and in turn improving safety for pedestrians. And lastly, there was also a lot of interest in ensuring that the limited curb space that is currently out there on Pearl Street is effectively managed, in particular around the East Somerville Community School, which is a major destination that generates a lot of trips each day. Adding another layer of context to the design and decision-making process is that it is not simply community feedback that influences what we end up designing. We have a growing number of long-range plans that include sometimes general and sometimes very specific direction for our street design projects. Our Vision Zero Action Plan, for example, which is our plan that outlines our ultimate goal of getting to zero traffic fatalities and serious injuries on Somerville streets, goes so far as to specify that, for example, 2 miles of sidewalk should be repaired annually, as consistent with the ADA transition plan, also shown here. And we want to be able to achieve as many of those goals as possible throughout this project and throughout all of our street design projects, also balancing that with the feedback that we hear from residents. We do also have a couple more long-range plans in the works right now that I'd be remiss not to mention. Those are the bike network plan and the citywide parking and curb use study. I've included links in the text here to both of those project pages as they are ongoing, and there is still an opportunity to learn more and give your feedback on those. While they will not be influencing this specific project, since we're already at the design phase for Pearl Street, we will likely have clear direction for cycling infrastructure priorities, as well as strategies for managing parking demand at some point later this year. So if you would like to learn more, the links are included there. So with that, let's get into the street design proposal. Before we get into specifics, I would just like to spend a minute discussing the traffic calming elements that are included in the design. So in the top left, if you haven't been through Spring Hill or the Ball Square neighborhood recently, I have a picture here of one of the speed humps that was recently installed. This one is over on Lowell Street. Speed humps are one of our more effective tools, still a fairly new one here in Somerville, but effective nonetheless in reducing vehicle speeds, particularly mid-block, so between intersections. On the top right is an image of a curb extension. So that is where you widen the sidewalk. You can see how the curb line juts out at the intersection at the crosswalk. These have a few different functions. One is to just shorten the distance that pedestrians have to cross an open lane of traffic. And just make it more comfortable. They can kind of stand here and make it clear that they want to cross without feeling like they're standing too close to traffic. It also has benefits for slowing vehicles that are taking turns. They can't cut that corner too sharply. And it also prevents vehicles from parking too close to the intersection as well, and just improves visibility for everyone. On the bottom left here, you can see an example of a neighborhood traffic circle. This is a new one for Somerville. We have not installed any of these to date. However, they do exist in a lot of places around the country, and there are a number of local examples as well. Actually, the photo that I used here is from Boston. So this is an intersection traffic calming treatment that slows vehicles moving through an intersection. And it's an effective tool at intersections where you want to improve pedestrian safety, but there's a little bit less traffic. It tends to work well at a more minor street location. Lastly, we have raised intersections on the bottom right. A raised intersection brings the whole roadway at a given intersection up to sidewalk level, which really prioritizes pedestrians and makes them feel more comfortable. From a traffic calming perspective, it forces vehicles to ramp up and then ramp back down as they either go straight or turn through the intersection, and just generally encourages better behavior from vehicles as pedestrians are crossing. Okay, so we're going to start at the left side of the corridor here. This is an aerial image that shows the McGrath to Cross Street section of Pearl. So I've highlighted all of the side street names here and put labels on those. Put a little symbol to show that McGrath Highway is a signalized intersection. And the next traffic control for Pearl Street is the signal at Cross Street. This is the only section that has any bus stops. So there are 2 bus stops currently on this section of Pearl Street. You can see the parked cars here. There is parking on both sides. There is 1 travel lane in each direction. And as we know, one of the sort of primary goals here and impetus for this project was to reconstruct the sidewalks and repave the street. So those are currently in poor condition, and we're hoping to fix that. And so sort of walking us through what this will look like and what our current proposal is on this section, we will start by reconstructing all of the sidewalks, as well as all of the curb ramps, which aren't explicitly drawn in here, but where all crosswalks are, all of the curb ramps will be brought in up to what we call compliance. So on any newer project that you'd see where we have those little rubber or metal mats that have some raised bumps as you approach the crosswalk and nice flat slopes, that's what we're going to have all up and down Pearl Street here. As well as putting concrete across the private ways. Currently, those are asphalt through the intersection and onto Pearl Street. So those will be continuous level sidewalk all the way across Pearl Street Place and Pearl Street Terrace. We will be adding new pavement. That part is pretty straightforward. Here are the approximate limits. We're going to go about 15 feet back from the right of way on each of the side streets. We'll be stopping just short of McGrath Highway because this is owned by MassDOT and we don't have jurisdiction to change their roadway. But we will be starting the project here, repaving all the way down here and continuing. And in terms of traffic calming elements, we will be putting a speed hump halfway on the block. This is only about 600 feet, maybe a little bit more. In the current standard that we're using is to have some sort of traffic calming element about every 300 feet between stopping locations. So if you have a signal here and a signal here, you're at about 300 feet. And so that's a great spot for a speed hump. And that would be constructed to the same standards as the other ones you've seen around Somerville. We will also be proposing a raised intersection at Cross Street. We know from staff's experience and from everything that we've heard from you all as community members who use this street, that Cross at Pearl is a very busy intersection for all modes of travel. However, given that this is a location that is very important to the East Somerville Community School in getting all of our kiddos over there safely, we believe that a raised intersection is an appropriate treatment for that intersection. And finally, we're just showing where where curb uses will fit in. So the bus stops will remain. We will be retaining residential permit parking on both sides of the street. And we went so far as to be specific about matching existing regulations. So there is currently a parking restriction at this corner to be able to retain some of the larger vehicle movements coming off of McGrath. So that is slated to stay the way it is. The bus stops will remain, and the residential permit parking that is currently there will remain as well in the approximate locations shown. Okay, so moving on to the middle segment of Pearl Street, it's going to follow the same sort of cadence here that we just went through on the McGrath to Cross section. So starting over at Cross, this was also shown on the last side, but we have the signalized intersection here at Cross Street. As you work your way down Pearl, you have Rush Street on the south side here. Then you hit the Glen Street all-way stop controlled intersection, Hillside Ave, and then Franklin Street is over here on the right. This segment is a little bit different than the last section. There is currently only parking on the north side from the south side sidewalk curb to the north side sidewalk curb. It's only about 25 feet. It's very narrow. And so there is just enough room for one travel lane in each direction and that one side of parking. But vehicles do travel right along the south side sidewalk as you're heading eastbound towards Sullivan on this side, whereas on actually both out of the screen to the left here and out of the screen to the right, it is a little bit wider and you are able to have parking on both sides. But again, sidewalk and pavement is in very poor condition, so we will be upgrading that as part of this project. So just showing those approximate sidewalk limits here again, calling out that we will be putting concrete across the private way at Hillside Ave, similar to what we were proposing to do at Pearl Street Place and Pearl Street Terrace. Approximate limits of all of the new pavement and showing where crosswalks will be restriped. And to get into discussion here about the traffic calming elements we'll be proposing, we already discussed on the left side of the screen here, the raised intersection at Cross Street. We will be maintaining the always stop control at Glen Street. So we're proposing a speed hump about halfway down this block to prevent cars from going too fast between this signal and this stop sign. And at Glen Street itself, in addition to just maintaining the stop signs that are already there, we will be also proposing one of the neighborhood traffic circles that I described earlier. We believe this could be an effective treatment to keep vehicle speeds down and to make it a little bit of a safer crossing for pedestrians, in particular knowing that this is another sort of key route to the East Somerville Community School. As you work your way further east, we have another speed hump halfway down this block. And then finally, we're ending with a raised intersection at Franklin Street. Now, it is interesting because sometimes we can anticipate what we might hear from the community just based on our own lived experience in a lot of cases. However, it's always really exciting to hear when there's something that we didn't necessarily know about or weren't considering. And Franklin Street is one of those examples. We heard from you all that Franklin Street was a location where safety was a priority, and that was not a location that we had originally been considering as a priority location for traffic calming investments. So we went back to the drawing board, and as part of this design proposal, we will be including a raised intersection to really confer priority to pedestrians. We will not be proposing any stop signs because there are stop signs on the next block at Myrtle already, but we believe that in really raising the sidewalk up, making sure we have crosswalks clearly marked on all legs will confer the priority that we're hoping to achieve in pedestrian crossings. And then lastly, with the curb use piece, residential permit parking will remain on the north side. And then we will need to sort of do a little bit of geometry changing at the Glen Street intersection to make sure this neighborhood traffic circle works, and to make sure that vehicles don't park too closely. So we will need to restrict a spot or two on those approaches. And so lastly here, we have the easternmost section of Pearl Street. Again, we have Franklin Street over on the left this time, which we've already discussed, but to make sure everyone has a point of reference, here's Franklin Street on the left. We then go down to Myrtle, which, as I mentioned, is always stop controlled. Florence, Pinckney, and then Mount Vernon, again, has stop signs on Pearl Street, all the way at the right-hand side of the screen here. Like I did mention on the last side, this section is a little bit wider. You have parking on both sides of the street, two-way travel again, and again, sidewalks and pavement are still in poor condition and could use some upgrades. So here's showing those same sidewalks and the approximate location of all the sidewalk upgrades. We don't have any locations along this section where private ways will be getting concrete. There are no private ways on this section. New pavement, and where crosswalks that already exist will be restriped. We have for traffic calming, we have the raised intersection at Franklin Street, which we just discussed. For Myrtle Street, again, we will be maintaining always stop control, but are proposing another neighborhood traffic circle here, as well as some curb extensions, some bump outs to make sure that this is nice and narrow and that people can't park too close to the intersection. And then as you work your way east, we will have a pair of speed humps, one on the Florence to Pinckney block and one on the Pinckney to Mount Vernon block. Excuse me one second. And then lastly, we have our curb use regulations, proposed curb use regulations on this easternmost block. Again, relatively similar to what currently exists today. Because of the proposed raised intersection at Franklin Street, and because of the location of a poorly placed hydrant or inconveniently placed hydrant in front of Aggie's here, we will need to shift this loading zone slightly, but otherwise parking will remain the same on this block. There is an accessible parking space currently on the halfway between Myrtle and Florence that will remain. And then generally speaking, residential permit parking will be retained on both sides of the street. One thing that I hadn't mentioned on the prior slides that is called out here, one thing we're trying to do as a general policy in the city on projects like this moving forward is to clearly mark where parking is not permitted at intersections and on approaches to crosswalks. If there isn't a sign, or even though it is illegal to park within 20 feet of a crosswalk in the city of Somerville, it's not always clear either by signage or by pavement markings that that's the case. And oftentimes it's very difficult to enforce that regulation everywhere. So we will be clearly marking within 20 feet of all the crosswalks on Pearl that it is no parking. And so where we can, such as at Myrtle, we will be using concrete to prevent people from parking, but where we can't, we will have at least paint and signage to ensure that people using the crosswalks are visible to drivers. So in summary, here are all of the existing conditions, everything, all of which I just went over. This image here is just more for reference for anyone that was at the first community meeting. You may recognize this from those slides, but it just shows the approximate location of all of the existing parking on Pearl Street, where all of the crosswalks and signals are, where bus stops exist, where always stop control exists. And then on this slide here, I've overlaid that with the highlights of our proposal, specifically in terms of the traffic calming. So approximately where we're proposing speed humps, raised intersections, and neighborhood traffic circles. And so you can see that there's kind of a cadence that we tried to create. You have a signal where you have to stop over at McGrath Highway, can't get too far without hitting a speed hump. You have another signal and a raised intersection to further improve safety at this, at the cross street location. Can't get too far again without hitting a speed hump. You get to this always stop and there's a neighborhood traffic circle. Continue to go along, speed hump, raised intersection at Franklin. And then when you hit another always stop, you have a neighborhood traffic circle. And then finally, even though there isn't stop control until the end of Mount Vernon here, you do have another 2 closely spaced speed humps. So it sets an expectation up and down the corridor. People have an idea of what to expect, but it still prevents them from going too fast and reduces speeding. We would expect pretty significantly, which is something that we were really trying to prioritize in this design. So again, to just sort of reiterate, what were we hoping to accomplish with what we've proposed here? Obviously, we want to rehab the sidewalks and all of the curb ramps. That's been a really important and fundamental piece of this. And so we really want to get going with this construction as soon as possible, because simply reconstructing the sidewalks doesn't require any design, just requires us to get our contractor out there. So we really want to get that going. However, we do want to reduce mid-block speeding, and we believe that the speed humps in the locations we're proposing them in can help us achieve that. We want to make sure that we're giving pedestrians priority and improving pedestrian safety at some of our major crossing locations, whether that's through raised intersections or neighborhood traffic circles, and really focusing on safety of children around the East Somerville Community School. And so having our more substantial treatments, the raised intersections and a neighborhood traffic circle in the vicinity of the East Somerville Community School was really important to us. And lastly, allowing the flexibility for some more fundamental changes to Pearl Street in the future. This isn't the end all be all. We don't want to sit here and pretend that this is everything that Pearl Street ever could be. And so while we're very excited about this proposal, we want to make sure it's also clear that we are allowing flexibility for even greater change to Pearl Street in the future. So what do I mean by that? One of the things that we had noted earlier in the presentation when Kate was going through a view of the feedback was that there was some interest in continuous protected bike lanes along Pearl Street. Unfortunately, one of the wrinkles to installing continuous protected bike lanes along this entire segment of Pearl Street is that the middle section from Cross Street to Franklin Street is actually too narrow to have bike lanes in both directions, even if you remove all the parking. So you would actually have to one-way Pearl Street to have bike lanes, continuous bike lanes in both directions along the entirety of Pearl Street. And so while this design does not preclude the installation of protected bike lanes at some future point with something as simple as signage and paint changes, we can't do that without one-waying Pearl. And that is going to require a much more substantial analysis that we have not had the capacity to undertake in this time. So if protected bike lanes are identified as a priority by the neighborhood, and as well as through the bike network planning process that we're currently undertaking, we could consider taking on such an analysis. But at this time, our goal and our priority is to get the sidewalks rehabilitated to focus on these traffic calming efforts, which we think will improve safety for cyclists, but to have a more fundamental conversation about the street network in East Somerville and about how protected bike lanes fit into that network at a later date. So with that, we will move into our discussion portion of the agenda.
Thanks, Adam. So as we gather your questions in the chat and prepare for spoken comment, we wanted to share an initial feedback poll. I'm also going to share a link to this, but you can go to www.menti.com and use the code 19135026. And we just have a quick couple questions just to gather initial feedback. but do you like it? What are you excited about? I'm going to share this in the chat now, and please continue to send in your questions via the chat. In just a few minutes, we'll share what we're seeing in the Mentimeter, as well as get into some of the chat questions. I'm just going to take over shared screen so that we can see what's coming in. So we're starting to see some people come in. So the first question is, how do you feel about the plans as a whole? So we have some folks sharing that they really like it. Some folks sharing that they don't love it, but could live with it. And some sharing that I'm not comfortable with the design as proposed. I give those few minutes, then I'll share out the numbers. And then we'll go on to the next question. Okay, we've got about 11 people saying they really like it right now, 9 saying they don't love it but could live with it, and 6 saying that they're not comfortable with the designs as proposed. We currently have 0 saying they're totally opposed. Again, folks, you can continue to share your questions in the chat. In just a few moments, we'll get started on that. Okay, give it about 20 more seconds left on this question, and then we'll go on to the next one. If you have any trouble whatsoever, please let me know through the chat. And again, this is just an optional poll. Okay, so at this time we have 13 saying they really like it, 11 saying they don't love it but could live with it, and 7 sharing that they're not comfortable with the design. To take us to our next question, we wanted to hear from folks initially, what are you most excited for? So you can input this in and it'll appear as a word cloud, and I'll share back some of the things we're seeing on the screen. So first we're hearing people are excited about speed humps, raised crosswalks, traffic circles, fixing the street, speed humps is increasing. People are sharing that they're interested in traffic calming, repaving and better paving, safety and raised intersections, pavement from the 21st century, some more interest in the traffic circles, interest in trees and green space, pedestrian prioritization. And right now, what we're seeing the most that people are excited about is paved street, raised crosswalks, traffic calming, and speed humps. We also have some daylighting intersections, smooth road, and reducing speeding. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We'll watch that for just a few more seconds. But again, please feel free to start to input your questions in the chat. And just a reminder for some who might have joined us a little bit later, we're going to read the questions out loud so that they can be heard in both English and Spanish. Okay, great. So just kind of ending our poll, we see paved street, traffic calming, raised crosswalks, speed humps, continuous sidewalks, and raised intersections as some of our things that people are most excited for. Thank you so much for taking that poll. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that Adam can take it back over and share our instructions for chat. Wonderful. So we have some questions coming in. I'm just going to share a little bit. I'm going to read them out loud so that we can all hear them. Just bear with me one moment. Wonderful. So one of our first questions that came in was regarding the parking data. And I might be combining some questions that came in, but if I incorrectly interpret them, please let me know through the chat. The first one was shared by Emily about they're a new resident to Pearl Street and they live between Cross and Franklin. and previously their home had been unoccupied and may have contributed to lower perceived parking use. Has the data that was collected for parking utilization, or has there been multiple collections of the parking utilization data?
That is a good question. Thank you. So we have not done any additional parking utilization study to date. It is a pretty heavy lift on our end. It may not seem like a very big sort of study area, but we do have to have our staff go out and walk every one of these streets and count vehicles as on every block. So we want to be very strategic about when we're prioritizing that effort. So some of the decisions we've made to date are using that data that we collected in April of last year. However, if we hear from residents that has changed fundamentally, that parking demand is actually lower or is significantly higher than what is seen here based on the data we've included so far, I think that would be an impetus for us to go back out and collect some additional data. So unfortunately, it's not something that we can do on a regular basis at this time, but if there is a good reason for us to go out and collect additional data, we certainly can and certainly will.
Thanks, Adam. So we had some questions come in about the traffic circles. First, someone asked, bear with me, I'm just combining a couple questions. Could you explain how the traffic circles work? In a sense of if you're coming in from Glen Street and looking to take a left, would you need to go all the way around the traffic circle to then take the left turn like you would for a rotary? And they shared some concern around people may not be doing that and they will just cut through the corner and take the turn, which will instead cause greater safety concerns, especially with young children that cross there. If I could just add to that question too, Adam, before you jump in, is will there be any prototyping of the traffic circle at the intersection? Because just some concerns around how does it work? How will people use it? How will it get plowed?
Yeah, those are both great questions. And I'll address the second one first. So yes, we are actually in the process of trying to do a little pilot test of sorts. It may be something as simple as setting up some cones with some spray paint to sort of mimic the size of the traffic circle that we would include, and asking one of our DPW trash truck drivers or one of our Somerville Fire Department engine drivers to come out and to actually do some test runs with us to see whether or not the geometry actually makes sense. So that's obviously in a larger vehicle. We could also take any one of our sedans or SUVs and do the same kind of experiment. We could even leave the cones up for a few hours and just sort of stand there and see how people interact with it. So yeah, I think that's something that would certainly be smart, and it's something we've talked about. We don't have specific plans for it yet, but I do agree that we should do some sort of quick build, easy testing of something like this before we get too far down the road. That said, we do know that these exist in other places as close as near as Boston. There's a very extensive program out in Seattle. So we also don't have any concerns. This isn't something that's brand new and has never been tried anywhere. We know that it has been done with success. And so we do believe in its potential benefits and its potential effectiveness. So we would like to do some testing, but are confident that it's something that could work as well. On the question about people taking left turns in front, that's something that we've been having discussions with internally about trying to figure out how it actually work. There are a couple of small distinctions between what we're proposing as a neighborhood traffic circle and another option, which is a mini roundabout. And so they look the same. However, at a mini roundabout, it would be yield control on all approaches, similar to, for anyone that's been through Powder House Circle recently, we changed all those, well, 5 out of the 6 approaches to Powder House Circle to yield control, so that you simply have to, as if you're a driver, you're approaching the intersection, you simply have to look for a pedestrian, stop for them, and then cross the crosswalk, look for a driver. And if there's no driver coming from your left, then you can simply enter the intersection. What we're proposing is a neighborhood traffic circle that continues. You're required to stop as you are today, no matter what, whether there's another car and another pedestrian coming or not. And in some cases, you are actually permitted to take left turns in front of the circle at a neighborhood traffic circle. And so that is an option that we could consider. And if we believe that people aren't going to comply and go all the way around, we may be able to design it such that we expect people to take that left and are permitted to do so. So that it's a really good question, and definitely a detail that we're talking about and are going to figure out what the best way to move forward is.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm going to combine a couple questions we got in regarding buses and larger vehicles, and then talk about some questions we got around bike facilities. So first, Katie asked that prior to the pandemic, the MBTA had shared that there was no plan to discontinue the 80 bus route. And one of the biggest bottlenecks on the 80 bus is the outbound only stretch from Cross Street through Pearl at McGrath and in East Somerville. Once the Green Line extension is up and running, is it possible to ask the MBTA to eliminate the Cross Street and Pearl Street stops in East Somerville when the bus is, and then goes into a little bit around delay? And I'm also just going to combine that where someone asked, will the stop lines at the Pearl and Cross intersections be pushed back to properly accommodate buses and other larger vehicles that turn there?
Kate, if it's helpful, I would be happy to answer the first part of the question about coordination with the MBTA and long-term planning associated with Route 80 bus service. And then I would ask Adam to speak about the specifics of the stop line question. That's okay. So thank you for that question. As folks who have been involved with MBTA's long-term planning may know, the MBTA is going through its first in a generation planning exercise to really think about whether its region-wide bus network serves the needs of our communities. Most MBTA bus lines are relics of the 1950s. And of course, the metro region has changed fundamentally since that time. The MBTA is learning from experiences around the country about taking a step back and really thinking about creating new services and routes to serve as many customers and communities as possible. The City of Somerville has been involved in these processes, and many of our residents have participated as well. At this time, we've received no indication that Route 80 service would be terminated or fundamentally modified, but we're planning for a possibility that the MBTA might suggest that this year. We would want to make sure that all East Somerville residents and stakeholders who rely on Route 80 bus service can be part of that conversation. You can follow up with us at transportation@somervillema.gov, which is a staff email that reaches all of the mobility division. And you can also get involved in the city's official advisory committee called the Pedestrian and Transit Advisory Committee. Several members live in East Somerville and are in attendance at tonight's meeting. We would want to hear from all of you to make sure that when we think about the curb use that is dedicated to the Route 80 outbound bus at Cross and at McGrath, that we're really thinking about that long-term future and connecting residents to opportunities to the Green Line itself, to Central Hill, Gilman Square, and of course Ball Square and Points West. So it's a long explanation, but I think the takeaway is at this time, it is our expectation that Route 80 stays where it is. And if that changes, we will notify the community as soon as possible to make sure we're generating more feedback so that if we wish to advocate for retention or for a different type of change, we're able to do so as a community. I hope that's a helpful answer, Katie. Thank you for your question. Adam, do you mind speaking about the specifics of the intersection?
Yes, so transitioning from a very big picture global question to a very technical and detailed question, we will be going through a lot of the fine-grained analysis of where stop bars and stop lines are located, if we need to do any further parking restriction to accommodate some of the turning movements of bigger vehicles once we've finalized the design direction. So we have a general proposal and about as much detail as we were willing to incorporate at this time. But once we've gotten sort of determined a final direction and take everything to final construction planning and documentation mode, we will do some of that additional analysis, and in particular the Cross at Pearl Street intersection, given that it carries the most heavy truck and bus traffic, and a lot of that traffic is turning as well. So yes, we will. Short answer is if we need to make any further changes to make sure that those movements are accommodated, we will do so.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so I'm going to combine a couple questions we got regarding bike facilities and bike travel patterns. I'll then go into some questions we got regarding trees and greenery, and then hop into some questions regarding the actual construction process and notification for residents. So first, Tom shared that it was conveyed in the survey that bike safety was especially important for people, especially people heading to school. But there really hasn't been that much discussion around how it's designed to achieve that. Could you talk about what standards such as traffic volumes and speed does the city follow in deciding a street is safe for people of all ages and abilities to bike on? And will the redesigned Pearl Street meet those standards? And before we go to that, I just want to add a couple of questions to that regarding bikes is, we factor in the fact of children traveling on bikes to schools? And because there are currently not a ton of bike infrastructure in East Somerville, where should bikers tend to go to safely get through? That might be too many questions in one, but Adam, if you want to tackle the first, which is what kind of standards do we use, such as traffic volumes, to determine if it's safe for people of all ages and abilities to bike on?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Tom. While we don't have a formal policy in the city, we do generally try to follow NACDO guidelines for most of our design and planning standards. Based on the data that we've collected to date and those NACDO standards, particularly after we've implemented some of the traffic calming that we're currently proposing, we believe that everything east of Cross Street on Pearl, everything from Cross down to Mount Vernon will meet the current NACDO standards for a bicycle boulevard, essentially, and will greatly increase greatly decrease the amount of speeding and therefore increase the amount of comfort for cyclists to essentially share the lane on that section, knowing that volumes are pretty low and do fall within that range. The only section that's a little bit more up in the air is the McGrath to Cross section. Current estimates or our latest data puts that at a little over 3,000 cars a day, and the current upper level for a shared facility is about 2,000 vehicles a day. So we would have to expect that any speed humps we're installing are deterring some cut through traffic that we imagine exist on that section, but it wouldn't go all the way to getting us that facility. And so there certainly could be an argument for building protected bike lanes on that section. And there could be an argument for building protected bike lanes all up and down Pearl Street, to be perfectly honest. It's definitely in a little bit of a gray area. However, we are weighing that against the parking demand needs that have been expressed throughout this process. And one of the challenges that we're currently running up against is that we don't have much in the way of a mitigation strategy. So knowing that parking is well used, even more well used than a lot of the other locations where we've implemented bike lanes recently, at the expense of on-street parking, and taking away, not having an alternative for those parking spaces, and particularly for pickup and drop off around the East Somerville Community School at those challenging times of day, is something that we've struggled with a little bit right now.
Adam, if I can add to your answer, part of the question was also, I believe, about the neighborhood network. So you mentioned a whole bunch of important stuff, but you did not mention the Gilman Street and Oliver Street neighborway that the city has been working on in partnership with Councilor McLaughlin, many local stakeholders and activists, as well as long-term plans for other important links in the neighborhood serving bike network. Do you mind going back to that for a moment, please?
Yes, thanks for the reminder, Brad. I was trying to remember all the parts of the question. But yeah, another important consideration that we've been weighing here is the network itself. And one of the things that we're excited about this construction package, or that is getting us excited about this construction package, is that we've been able to tackle some specific intersection safety improvements in a way that we haven't been able to do in the past. And we are actually tackling the neighborway that runs parallel to the majority of Pearl Street as part of this streets construction package. And actually, we have a slide in the appendix here of Cross Street at Gilman and Oliver. It's currently signed as a formal neighborway for the city of Somerville with legal contraflow biking, but we really want to upgrade that to provide separated bike facilities at the intersection where they're most critical on a facility of this type. Traffic calming, so Cross at Gilman and Oliver here would get a fully raised intersection, the same way Cross at Pearl would, and continuing this design methodology, albeit with not the same exact treatments, down Oliver Street towards Glen and the Capuano, as well as up Gilman towards Walnut and at Walnut specifically, in Ed Leather's Park. So that has certainly played into our thought process here in terms of, are there viable alternatives for people cycling around the neighborhood, and can we improve those connections as well? And we believe that we will be doing that through this, what we're calling the Pearl +6 construction package.
Thanks, Adam. So I know we're coming up to 7:15. I'd love to ask the questions regarding trees, then give time for people to provide their comments spoken out loud, and then revisit some of our questions regarding construction updates, process for notification of residents, and then we had some more clarification questions regarding the specific traffic calming elements. So team, we've gotten questions regarding trees and greenery were also shared as high priorities by survey respondents. Is there any process to increase trees along the street? And also, will any trees be removed within the construction process? We also got a question regarding, is there planting possibilities with the traffic circles?
All great questions. Thank you for relaying those, Kate. So let's see. We will not be removing any trees as part of this project, unless they are dead or dying, and as identified by our city arborists. So no worries there. And in fact, that is definitely something that we always start our design process considering. We try not to move curbs unless we absolutely have to, knowing that whether we move them in or out, it certainly could impact tree roots and increase that tree's likelihood of dying if it's currently doing well. So that is not proposed as part of this project. We will not be moving curbs in most locations. And we will ask our contractor to we will explicitly asking them to provide tree protection and take extreme care around existing trees. So no worries there. We will also be increasing the amount of trees planted on Pearl Street as part of this project. We haven't gotten to that phase of the design yet. We have been in talks about whether or not something like replacing a parking space with an in-street tree could make some sense. However, there are some concerns from our arborist about whether or not a tree like that would survive given all of the salting and plowing that happens on city streets. So something a little bit more, something newer or a little bit more exotic like that is still in the works and unlikely to be included as part of this design, although we'll continue to talk about it. That said, when we go out and we're talking with our contractor, once we have one on board to begin this process, for the last few years, we have been going out with our arborist and walking the corridor and identifying new tree pit locations. So the contractor will essentially just leave a piece of sidewalk open as identified by our arborist, and then the piece of team will come back, the Parks and the urban forestry team will come back and they will put a tree in there afterwards. So we don't have numbers yet and we haven't decided exact locations, but wherever our arborist determines is viable, we will be adding trees. There was another part to that question, wasn't there, Kate?
Yes, it was about possibilities of plantings within
yes.
the traffic circles.
Yeah, and so that's another reason that we are considering the neighborhood traffic circles, is because unlike a raised intersection, you do actually have an opportunity to do something a little different, to add some greenery and do something a little more aesthetically pleasing. So we, again, have more work to do to figure out all the specifics, but we would love to put a tree in the neighborhood traffic circles that we're proposing. However, we need to figure out whether or not that would conflict with any utilities underneath. If those utilities are right in the middle of the street and they're only a few feet below the surface, obviously that's not going to work because the tree roots, we have to have room for the tree roots. So if that's not possible, we'll likely consider something a little more subtle, like you see, like you saw in the earlier slide. I'll go to it now. In this slide here, where you just, I mean, these are very small shrubs, obviously, but at least something, if grass or as big of shrubs as is reasonable, we would like to include something like this, even if it's fairly modest in the design. So that's our hope. We want to go as big as we can, and a tree would be great, but we need to do a little bit more work to figure out whether or not that's possible.
Thanks, Adam. So we still, as I mentioned, have some questions regarding communications to residents around construction, clarification questions around traffic calming elements. We received questions around how this will affect housing affordability. With the upgrades, would it affect gentrification? And then also we got some questions just regarding preventing people from parking in the crosswalks. Before we get to those, we do want to give time to spoken comment. We have 2 hands raised currently in the list. Adam, if you could go to the next slide and share the instructions. So as we mentioned, to speak out loud during the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find the button by clicking the reactions button in your toolbar. And a window will pop up with a raise hand button, and we will call on you when it's your turn and unmute your microphone. If you're joining by phone today, you can press *9 to raise your hand. And as a reminder, please make sure to have your language selected in interpretation so that if questions are provided in English or Spanish, we can all hear. So first, I want to start with Aaron. Aaron, I'm going to unmute you now, and then after Aaron comes Tom and Tori.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks all for this awesome presentation and great update. Really appreciate you taking the time to run through this with us tonight. I just have a couple of comments that I will try to keep as brief as I can. So just, I mean, overall, it kind of seems like, you're putting this as a slow traffic street where, cyclists could be biking in the road with traffic comfortably. I don't think this design accomplishes this yet. I know there are probably some things you're still figuring out, so forgive me if any of these comments are things that you're still thinking about. But you know, as it kind of is, people might slow down at speed humps, but there are streets like this around Somerville that I've biked on and still get very aggressive passing and quite scary conditions. A couple kind of quick suggestions of ways to potentially think about fixing this. And I also want to say, I also appreciate the fact that you've kind of not included the curb extension as a way to not preclude future protected bike lanes. So I understand that trade-off. One thing here that I'm just noticing is if the road is not striped, you know, with the parking lane designated and with parking spots striped out. I biked on streets around Somerville that have that, and when there are not cars parked in those spaces, it essentially becomes a very wide street because it just looks totally open, which really encourages speeding. So really demarking that, setting up really clear boundaries, showing that the width of the street is narrow will be really important to making it feel safe and slow traffic. Yeah, also appreciate again the lack of the bump outs being a reason for potential future protected bike lanes. And that is a difficult trade-off because you know the bump outs are really important for safety, but just paint will not cut at intersections. They'll be used as short-term parking or you know delivery zones. Just paint is not going to provide actually that daylighting that you're looking for. So just maybe looking into movable curbs or flex posts, or just you know kind of wondering what are some of the other tools that you might have in your toolbox to be able to really better regulate those areas. Also wondering about the bus stops, you know, is there a way to bump those out into the traffic lane so buses don't have to pull onto the sidewalk or to the sidewalk, which, you know, makes it a lot slower for them. You know, maybe looking at some quick build solutions if you don't want to, again, put in a curb there. Also just wondering about any other traffic calming procedures like chicanes, you know, tree plantings and boxes, on the side of the roads and parking spots to help narrow it down, provide that visual friction. And also just want to comment and say that, you know, would love to see some parking removed on this street. You know, this plan doesn't really do much to kind of reduce the abundance of parking we have in Somerville, which is a really important tactic that we have to also encourage more sustainable transportation modes. So thank you all.
Thank you, Aaron. So we have 4 more hands raised. And I just want to remind folks, I want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to share their questions as well as get to some of the ones that we had in the chat. So Tom, would you like to go next, followed by Tori, Katie, and Consuelo?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. As an East Somerville resident who uses Pearl Street every day, I'm really excited for the traffic calming. And I think on some of the eastern sections of Pearl Street, the traffic calming might be sufficient to make it safer for people to bike. But I have some concerns for Pearl Street, especially further west, especially west of Cross Street. Some of my concerns are, so right now, East Somerville doesn't have any southbound bike lanes whatsoever. There are a couple over in West Somerville, but if you're in East Somerville, you want to bike southbound towards Cambridge, there's not a single southbound bike lane unless you go more than a mile outside of East Somerville all the way to Cedar Street. Seeing that right now there aren't any bike lanes included on Pearl Street at all, I'd really like to hear from the city how they're making sure that there's a safe connection to a southbound bike lane somewhere. For example, Cross Street doesn't have any bike lanes. I know that McGrath will have high quality bike lanes relatively soon. So I would really like to see the city adding a bike lane on Pearl Street for accessing the future bike lane on McGrath. Or if there's some other connection I'm not aware of, but I think there's not really any alternative for people who will want to make that connection in the future, and there's not any other bike lanes to go south anywhere nearby. So I hope that's something that the city is looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Next we have Tori, and then followed by Tori is Katie and Consuelo.
Hi, thank you all for working on this. My question is regarding green infrastructure. I don't see any plans for any bioswales. I imagine flooding is a concern on Pearl Street, and there are certainly certain spots that flood more readily. I don't know where those are, but you have, sure there's been research done, and perhaps you've done some already. So are we going to be able to add green space as well as the traffic calming effect that bioswales have on Pearl Street? Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that question, Tori. I do wish our Director of Engineering, Brian Postlethwaite, was on the call today, because I think he would be able to answer that better than I could. But my understanding is that something like a bioswale is outside of the scope of this project. I truthfully don't know exactly what would need to go into something like that to be achieved, and something like that is certainly possible on a capital improvement project such as Somerville Ave, the Union Square Somerville Ave project. But I think my understanding is that would be that any kind of basic drainage or subsurface work that would fundamentally alter the way the drainage system is set up is outside of the scope of this project. This is really more about repaving the street and redoing the sidewalks, and is a little bit more superficial. So I apologize, that's not a great answer, but we can also follow up with you. I can ask Brian to follow up with more information.
Adam, if I can just join on to that answer again, thanks for bringing that topic up. It is outside the scope of a project like this one, but the city is learning a lot from our recent Somerville Avenue project in Union Square about exactly those types of surface green infrastructure techniques. And we're actually building a whole bunch more in our Spring Hill neighborhood starting this year. So as we think about how to scale up these types of stormwater management solutions, we may well be able to come back to East Somerville streets in general, or even Pearl Street specifically for other projects in the future, even though it's not part of our scope or schedule at this time. So thanks again.
Okay, great. Next we have Katie.
Thank you. I was wondering if the city had been able to successfully implement any short-term parking options in residential neighborhoods that might provide an upgrade in terms of the double parking of both, your school and daycare drop-off, your couriers, your food delivery, your ride-sharing services, and just residents, who need to drop somebody off and just don't have a spot to quickly pull over to do it.
Okay, why don't I answer that first, then ask Adam or anybody else to chime in. Thanks for raising that question, Katie. Evaluating curb regulations is becoming a part of our standard toolkit on a lot of our resurfacing or safe streets projects. We talked a little bit about what we call daylighting, meaning restricting parking up to crosswalks to improve safety and visibility. But another thing that we've been doing on recent projects is exactly what you're describing, making sure that the curb space itself, if it's going to be used for motor vehicle parking, that we're really being thoughtful about ADA specific regulations, about short-term pickup and drop-off activities like you described, meters and loading zones to serve our small businesses. And so that can be part of our team's next assignment here to really work through the neighborhood scale parking and curb regulations. Adam had included in one of his slides earlier that we have a citywide process where we're actually evaluating the entire city's street and curb spaces and all of the policies and allocations associated there. This is going to give us great information and feed into the follow-up to your question. So thanks for bringing it up, and we'll be looking forward to following up.
Okay, thanks team, and thank you, Katie. Next we'll go to Consuelo. And again, if anyone wants to ask or share a comment out loud, just a reminder to please raise your hand. Afterwards, we'll go back to those outstanding questions regarding construction, clarification of the traffic calming. And yeah, sounds there. So Consuelo, you are next. I'm gonna unmute you now.
Mute. Oh, hold on. Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to speak up. I was thinking to do it in Spanish or in English, but I think I will do it better in English. I am a resident of Somerville for more than 30 years, being very active, and I have seen and participated in many beautifications and many beautiful projects that is making our city more valuable and more welcome to diverse families. However, one of the things that are really concerning me for a long time is that our diverse community is fading because of the housing prices and the rent prices. And I see this project as making something beautiful for our city, but at the same time, I'm concerned about taxes going up. As a result, we will see the housing prices going up, the rent prices going up, and more negative things that are going to impact my community, minority community in this case. So the question is any plans, anything that, how are we going to, are you guys going to protect for not these things to happen in the community? Because you know, when beautiful attracts more people that can pay more money and people who has higher income. And unfortunately, in my community, we are people who are just surviving, struggling for housing. And we have seen and witnessing many landlords raising the rents, and house prices are not affordable for our community anymore. So that's my question. What are we going to do, or what is the plans to protect the community from this to happen? Thank you, and looking forward to go and jump up and down and drive around East Somerville. Thank you.
Kate, if it's okay, I'll attempt to start answering Consuelo's question. Thank you very much for bringing up that important topic. I think it's important for us to remind folks at the meeting tonight and everybody who's in your networks that in our office, we are not just a transportation or safety group. We're actually part of a larger mayor's office that includes literally 20 affordable housing specialists. They're part of the same department and they report to the same boss who I report to. We have another group of 6 small business specialists. We talked a little bit tonight about urban forestry and stormwater management. We've got 6 public space and urban forestry specialists. When we propose safety and accessibility projects like the Pearl Street project, it's really important that the city mobilizes all of its different offices to make sure that we are thinking about all of those impacts that you described. I wanted to list off a couple of quick items for folks who want to follow up on these issues, and then I will speak with Ellen, who runs our Office of Housing Stability, and Mike, who runs our housing group, to think about whether there are other specific tools that we want to follow up with you, with Councilor McLaughlin and others. But first and foremost, the city has a series of assistance programs, of homeowner and tenant support programs that range from information, tenants' rights, tenant-landlord conflict resolution and matching, all the way up to tax abatements and financial incentives for landlords who perhaps don't just follow the market and raise the rent every year. The city has begun using direct acquisition of properties to build what we call a community land trust. And we use other acquisitions with community-based nonprofit partners to stabilize housing and make sure that it's permanently affordable to our residents. So any resident who is dealing with a landlord issue, a rent hike, or a stability issue has a series of staff here at City Hall who speak 5 major different languages and are working around the clock to support them and make sure that they're being protected and treated fairly. But in the longer term, it's also important to know that we are trying to grow our tax base and shift the tax burden away from our residential homeowners and onto commercial land uses that help stabilize tax rates for landlords that, of course, that they might pass along to tenants. And then lastly, we also provide, again, a series of abatements for seniors for low income and veteran and other special groups of homeowners. So if you look up online, Somerville Housing Stability Office, Somerville Housing Division, you'll find access to resources. And in particular, for this neighborhood, just make sure that folks know that we have an Office of Immigrant Affairs that we've built over the last few years that provide a great deal of services and access, case support and routing of concerns for constituents and residents. So Kate, why don't we make sure that our project file for the Pearl Street project includes all of these other non-transportation issues, because we know that it is one big system, like you said, Consuela. So thanks, and I hope that's a helpful discussion.
Thanks, Brad. I want to add to that too. Everything that we've shared tonight, we want to make sure to send in a follow-up thank you to all those who had registered to this meeting. So we'll make sure to include that in that email. So thank you those who have raised their hands and provided comments. I want to get back to some of the questions that we didn't get to in the chat, but if you have any questions or wanted to speak out loud, please raise your hand. As I mentioned, we had gotten some questions regarding construction and notification to residents. Combining a couple of questions that we got in, team, could you talk through the process of how residents will be notified and how, so one question was around what will be the process used to inform residents about when work will be taking place so they can adjust accordingly, and what measures will be taken to reduce property harm during major construction.
Adam, do you mind taking the first answer to this question on behalf of our engineering group? And again, since we have other community meetings tonight and not everybody is here, we can follow up with written information about construction impacts notification and protection of properties nearby during construction.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll mention is that on our next slide here on the screen now, we do have a construction alerts page. So if you're not already, I would recommend signing up for construction alerts, which will give you a more detailed sort of understanding, a more detailed week by week update of what's going to be happening on Pearl Street. That said, this is not the level of construction that we're not really going underground. We're simply going to be what we call breaking out the sidewalks. And this is going to be the majority of the construction in the slowest part. We'll be breaking out the sidewalks. So jackhammering up all the existing concrete. They will be digging up the curb and doing what we call resetting it. And so just making sure that it's at the correct height and using equipment to make sure that all the curb is in the right place if they need to, not touching it if they don't have to, and then they'll come back and they'll re-pour. So this isn't the kind of construction where you have big machinery going really deep under the ground and doing all kinds of work that would impact someone's home. So that really, to the best of my knowledge, that has not been an issue on projects of this magnitude to date. Our engineering team also is very quick to respond. We have a construction liaison, Jesse Moose, who is available if there are any concerns and will reach out if there are specific issues. For example, we had on College Ave this past year, a retaining wall on someone's property that was actually going to fall into the street as soon as our contractor touched the sidewalk there, simply because of the way the earth on their property had pushed this retaining wall. And so Jesse went so far as to call, email, write a letter to this resident to ensure that they could coordinate on that. So if it's a very specific issue like that, we'll certainly be, and our team will certainly be in contact with you. Other than that, I would sign up for construction alerts. And then when there's something like parking restrictions or pedestrian detours, that will all be signed appropriate. So certain blocks of Pearl Street will be closed off for certain sections when for certain times during the workday when they will be doing the work. So you may have to cross the street and go on the other side of the block. We will always be maintaining one sidewalk on any given block open at any time so that pedestrians can still get up and down the street without having to walk on dirt. And then there will be sort of the standard parking ban signs when that we put up around the city when we need to restrict parking. The only other thing I'd add is that one of the other major components of this is the actual repaving. So that option is actually quite short and only takes construction wise, it only takes about a week or so. So they have to mill down the street, basically grind away the first 2 inches of asphalt. They have to make sure all the manholes and gas openings and all of that sort of utility work is in the right place. So they'll raise or lower those as needed, and they'll come back one day and repave the street. And so obviously cars aren't permitted on the street at any point. And so we do require that our contractor send out letters and notify abutters directly when that work is happening, because obviously you won't be able to either leave or get into your driveway or park on the street. But that should be limited to only a couple of days, but we will make sure that people are notified. Other than that, just keep an eye out for the signs, keep up to date on the construction alerts, and hopefully, we'll try to minimize the impact.
Thanks, Adam. So I want to dive into some clarification of the traffic calming elements and further requests. So someone asked, Denise shared that Florence Street to Mount Vernon Street are frequently used for cut-through traffic between Broadway and Washington Street. Can these all be raised crossings?
Yeah, so at this time, that is not currently part of our proposal. One thing that we do have to take into consideration with these projects is that this is really a maintenance project where we're trying to really extend the limited dollars that we get for this project as far as possible. And raised intersections in particular are very expensive to build because they require you to lift up the entire street, and that affects the way that water flows on the street. So you are doing, while we don't do a lot of work to the utilities and lines underneath, you do actually have to change where the water drains. They're called catch basins. They're, the grates that you see on the street. Those have to move in a lot of cases to be able to accommodate that raised crosswalk. And that work starts to get very expensive very quickly. And I think, as great as it would be to install more raised intersections, we do have to prioritize where we're putting that type of treatment, and we get the most bang for our buck at the busier locations. So I think the ultimate goal is to make sure that vehicles are going slow enough and are stopping for pedestrians. And we do believe that speed humps can accomplish that same goal, particularly given that section of, and I can go to that now just to reference it. There is certainly an amount of cut through traffic as you're heading on Pearl over to Mount Vernon, but generally speaking, it is a little bit lower than some of the other sections of Pearl, and most of it is just heading eastbound. So we believe that just given the number of pedestrians and with the addition of the speed humps, that it can become a lot more comfortable and that people will do a better job of yielding to pedestrians on this section.
Thanks, Adam. So I'm just going to use a couple more questions, and I know we need to round out of the meeting soon, respect everyone's time. Could we talk a little bit about, or Joan asked, currently the crosswalks get parked in a lot. How will we prevent cars from parking too close to the crosswalks or in the crosswalks?
So I think there are a couple of different things that we can do to make sure that we're achieving proper compliance from people parking. I think at a minimum, we're going to be installing signs as you get closer to crosswalks to make it very clear where you can't park, and then paint as well. I think we're also considering whether or not something like flex posts would be something that would make sense right now. As Aaron had alluded to earlier, and actually I think he asked the same question, we're trying to be really cognizant of not building curb extensions into Pearl Street, big curb extensions into Pearl Street. To the degree we're trying to avoid that to the degree we can, so as not to preclude a more fundamental change to Pearl Street in the future, such as bike lanes in both directions. And so short of curb extensions, which are definitely the most effective way to stop people from parking too close to a crosswalk, we can do something like throw 1 or even 2 flex posts. I don't think it'll take much to make sure that make sure that people aren't getting too close. So we haven't decided whether or not we're going to incorporate that right now, or if we'll be monitoring it location by location and going back to add more later. However, if that's something that's identified as a concern, it's really not a whole lot of additional, there aren't many additional resources required on our part to incorporate that in the design. I think the trickiest piece would just be making sure that our plowing operators are aware of it, and that we've incorporated that into our snow season planning. So.
Thanks, Adam. So I know we haven't gotten to everyone's questions, but I wanted to make sure we had some questions regarding clarifying the timeline of the project. Adam, could you walk us through again the expected timeline? And this will kind of lead into our next steps of gathering some more input and again, closing out today.
Excuse me. Yeah, sure thing. So going back to the anticipated project timeline, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we're kind of treating this as more of a kickoff rather than sort of the last piece of this sort of what is our second round of engagement with this project. So this is we've just released the designs. We'll be getting them on the website. We'll be going to all our various committees now over the course of the next month. We'll be talking with staff and parents at the East Somerville Community School, at the businesses along the corridor. This is really where we have to really go all in on our end, on the staff's end, and make sure that we're reaching everyone and collecting all of the feedback on what we propose. So unless there is a fundamental shift in the design that we proposed, at which point I think we'd have to have another community conversation, our plan right now is to make any changes within reason based on what we're hearing from the community, finalize that design direction, assuming we're generally on the right path, and have honored the community's feedback to date. And if that is, if that's all well and good, the goal is to do that at the beginning of March, and then it'll take about 2 months to turn that sort of final design direction into a set of construction documents. So there are some of those detailed questions came up tonight, but it's things like that, like how where does the stop line actually go? Where do all the signs go? Does drainage need to be adjusted? Like, how tall is this curb ramp going to be? Like, there are a lot of little details that that we never end up talking about at community meetings that need to be figured out, and that does take time. So we need to allow at least a couple months for that to happen. And I think ideally we'd be getting going sometime this spring. The bid is currently out on the street. We're waiting to hear whether or not we had any contractors bid on the project. So assuming we did, and assuming it comes back on budget, we could get started as early as sometime this spring on the actual construction. But I don't want to commit a hard time for the actual start of construction to you guys quite yet, but we will keep everyone posted, and we will be posting additional information to the project website, as well as through construction alerts when appropriate.
Thank you, Adam. So that segues into us closing and sharing some of our next steps. Before we go into some of those details, and Adam, if you wouldn't mind putting the slide up on the screen, I would like to invite Councilor McLaughlin to close us out, and then we will share the next steps and say goodnight to everyone. So Councilor McLaughlin, would you like to share?
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you for running this meeting and thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm going to add.
Oh, Counselor, you're muted at this time.
You think I get used to this by now? Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to all the city staff for running this meeting. I just put my contact information in the chat box again in case anybody needs to get a hold of me. I think the poll was interesting, especially the group of people who said they're not happy with it, but they can learn to live with it. I think I'll take that as a positive because it means that maybe we can make some improvements and get more people happy with the project. So please feel free to contact me. I have my phone number, email address there. I just wanted to address a couple comments I heard. The biggest one I heard from Consuelo as well as another resident about affordable housing, which is the most important issue to me, of course. And it's a frustrating, it's a double-edged sword when you're dealing with improvements to the community, because on the one hand, you make improvements and the neighborhood gets more expensive. On the other hand, the neighborhoods that have the least money often get the least improvements. And that's what happens a lot, especially with street and road design across the country and in the city. So I often struggle to get projects like this off the ground because the demand is met elsewhere by people who know how to get what they want. And people on this side of town don't necessarily always advocate for themselves and try to get improvements to the community. So I would say, you know, it's a tough give and take because you want nice things and you also want things to be affordable. I know that the only thing I'd add with this is, you know, Pearl Street has been a mess for as long as I've known it's been, and the property values keep going up. So I don't think that this is going to have a major impact on the affordability of the city outside of everything else that's going to have an impact on it. This is going to be 50% funded by the state, so hopefully it won't be a hit on people's tax dollars, so that's a positive. And there's a number of other affordable housing initiatives that we're working on the city and state level that I think really need to move forward, and we're trying to do what we can on those issues. I just wanted to acknowledge that because it is an important issue to me as well. I had a comment from Dorothy who mentioned she'd love to have some sort of neighborways community art space, especially on the speed bumps, which are more like speed mounds. And I've been on the speed mounds on Morrison Ave, and I've almost topped out of my car or leveled out because there were no lines on it at the time. There are lines now, but it'd be cool to have something there, a community art effort, especially maybe around the East Somerville School and on these speed mounds to both remind people they exist and also to have some community art. And I also had another comment, a concern about making Pearl Street a one-way street. Just to clarify, that is not a part of the current proposal. This is it's something that we would have to have a further discussion on if we wanted to see that happen. So thank you, everybody. As I mentioned, my contact info is there. You can email me with questions or call me with questions. And you could also ask to get on my mailing list so we can get more updates in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Councilor McLaughlin. Everyone, thank you so much for giving your time this evening to join us for this public meeting. We are going to be releasing a survey, and this will be available both online in our project website as well in print copies. I will make sure to email this to anyone that registered to this event. And again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. You can reach out to us and the project team. But again, feel free at any time to email transportation@somervillema.gov. And please make sure to sign up for construction alerts. We have both a newsletter. We have the alerts, which come through as texts, emails, phone calls, whichever works best for you in the language that you speak. And within the survey, we're going to be asking questions on the traffic calming elements, asking you about public art opportunities, and gathering other input. So thank you again. We hope you have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to moving forward in this project. Thank you.
Kate, let's give a big round of applause to our interpretive staff support, Erica and Claudio. It's a really, really hard job. We appreciate you doing this work, and we look forward to following up with folks who have been following along in Spanish. Thanks again.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.